Starting this introduction was to look at a very basic question about revolution, which is what is one and why are they so important to us? And I think one of the best summaries of what a revolution is comes from Trotsky's History of Russian Revolution. It's actually on the very first page of the book if you get a copy of it. And what he says in that is that the most indubitable feature of a revolution is the direct interference of the masses in historical events. In ordinary times, the state, be it monarchical or democratic, elevates itself above the nation, and history is made by specialists in that line of business: kings, ministers, bureaucrats, parliamentarians, journalists. But at those crucial moments, when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break over the barriers, excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime. And as inevitably happens with revolutionary anniversaries, the ideologues of capitalism will not try and draw that conclusion. They will instead paint a different one of violence, of bloodshed, of one-person rule, and so on, and try and paint a straight line from Lenin to Stalin and then on to Putin today. But for us, the Russian Revolution is the most important event in history. It's the only time workers themselves have held power for a sustained period of time, and in that, in just a year of the revolution happening, then Russia was out of the First World War, the banks and industry had been nationalised, and all sorts of progressive social changes had taken place. Legalising divorce, LGBT rights were improved. The old homophobic Tsarist laws were not enforced anymore. They experimented with communal laundries, cheap canteens. They created the first nature reserve and all sorts of other environmental protection bodies as well. And whilst the revolution did subsequently degenerate under Stalin and eventually led to a re-establishment of capitalism in a brutal form in the 90s, that is something that we can also give an explanation towards as well. But that doesn't detract from the heroism of the early period of the revolution. And in preparation for this introduction, then I reread Trotsky's Lessons of October, which is a fantastic book comrades should read and needs bringing back into print. But that was an introduction to Trotsky's writings in 1917, written with a bit of hindsight after the failures of the German and Bulgarian revolutions in 1923, and written to try and draw out some of the lessons of why the Bolsheviks had been successful in 1917. And Trotsky makes the point of the importance of studying revolutions. He said, had we failed to study the Great French Revolution, the Revolution of 1848 and the Paris Commune, we should have never been able to achieve the October Revolution. And whilst there have been revolutionary movements since then, the Russian Revolution is the high point, I think, of those struggles. And Trotsky also commented in relation to the development of the Communist International that came out of the revolution, that the leaders of the European Communist parties who failed to assimilate the history of October by means of a critical and closely detailed study would resemble a commander-in-chief preparing new wars under modern conditions who fails to study the strategic, tactical and technical experience of the last imperialist war. Such a commander-in-chief would inevitably doom his armies to defeat in the future. And that, I think, retains its full force today. So why was there a revolution in Russia in 1917? Marxists hadn't expected a socialist revolution to take place in Russia first. They expected it to take place in a developed capitalist country. And that was because they expected a socialist society to have a higher development of the means of productions which would be necessary to give socialism a higher material basis. In particular, socialists at the time looked towards Germany, where the Social Democratic Party there was the strongest section of the international movement at that time. It had 1 million members, 80-odd daily papers, and was incredibly, potentially incredibly powerful. But the development of capitalism around the world didn't repeat the same stage as it did in Western Europe. You had the development of something called combined and even development, which meant as imperialism developed, capitalist countries looked for bigger profits by investing abroad. That meant that the weak forces of the bourgeois, the capitalists, became junior partners, often in collaboration with sections of the landlords in those countries, and therefore were not prepared to play the classical role in capitalist revolutions. And therefore, a major debate at that time amongst Russian socialists was how can Russia move forwards? Some thought that because Russia was a feudal country, then it didn't matter the economic relationships of the with the imperialists, that the bourgeois would have to lead a revolution, and the role of socialists would be to support that. This was the position of the majority of the Mensheviks, the minority of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party at the time, and the Social Revolutionaries, which is a middle class party that orientated towards the peasantry in Russia. But other sections of the movement drew the lessons of the past and looked to what other major classes in society could lead a revolution. There were two other major classes in Russian society. The peasantry was one, the majority of the country, but it was scattered across the whole wide, vast territory of the Russian Empire, and therefore it was very difficult for peasants to organise, based as they are on their individual plots of land. The other class, the proletariat or working class, was much smaller, but it was concentrated in cities and in very big workplaces. The Putilov works in Petrograd, for example, employed 10,000 people just in that one factory. And therefore Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the majority of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, put forward the idea that these classes together, through a democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, could carry through those capitalist revolutionary tasks. And those two classes would play a role in in the events that took place. But Lenin's formula was somewhat algebraic. It left to history the question of which of those classes would play the leading role. Trotsky, though, and a few other lefts argued that the peasantry had never played an independent role due to its nature. They'd always gone in behind the capitalists or the working class. And therefore, he argued that workers would play the key role in this revolution, and they would have to win over the most important sections, the poorest of the peasantry. Trotsky's key insight, though, was that if workers led the revolution, then why would they stop at the capitalist tasks of a revolution? He argued they'd go over and proceed with socialist demands, including nationalisation, control of their industry, and so on. Both Lenin and Trotsky, though, argued that for the revolution to consolidate itself, it had to be linked to the international revolution. A revolt in Russia would trigger revolutions elsewhere, especially in Europe, which, if successful, could provide the material support that would be necessary for the Russian Revolution being in a backwards, less developed country. And this predicted what was to occur. In the period running up to the revolution, we had the First World War. By 1917, that had been 3 years long. 2 million people had died in that period. On International Women's Day, the 8th of March now, but February according to the Gregorian calendar, women marched in Petrograd for bread. That set off a mass movement, and within days, the whole of Petrograd was on strike. When the Tsar sent the troops in to put it down, they mutinied. And drawing on their experience from the revolution of 1905, workers set up Soviets of workers' deputies, elected bodies from different workplaces to discuss the way forward. These bodies fell into the political leadership of the Menshevik and Social Revolutionary parties. Following the logic of their position, they ceded power to a provisional government of bourgeois forces. This led to a position of dual power. Whilst the official government was in the hands of the capitalist provisional government, the socialists were the ones with mass support and with, and to an extent, the real power, the real support amongst the people. And the provisional government in these conditions achieved none of the tasks it set out for itself. It didn't end the war, it didn't end the crisis of the food supply, and there was no date set for elections to a constituent assembly. When Lenin returned from exile at the beginning of April, he came into conflict with a section of Bolshevik leaders who in reality had adopted a position similar to that of the Mensheviks in practice, of trying to be just an opposition current to the provisional government, not challenging that government in the process of doing that. Scarcely off the train, he jotted down what are now his famous April theses, but those were voted down 13-2 at the first Petrograd committee of the Bolsheviks that he attended. But through democratic debate, which got taken into the ranks of the party, was decided at a conference of the Bolshevik Party, then Lenin was able to convince the majority of the Bolsheviks of his position. Meanwhile, this was going on, the provisional government moved deeper into crisis. Milyukov, who was a leader of the Capitalist Constitutional Democrat Party, or Cadets, had ordered an offensive in order to appease the allies of Russia in the First World War, which was continuing. This, because of the huge opposition to the war, led to a crisis, with Milyukov resigning and bringing into the provisional government some of the leaders of the Soviet. Some workers and Bolsheviks, already frustrated at the lack of any change, called for down with the provisional government. But Lenin instead raised the slogans down with the 10 capitalist ministers and all power to the Soviets, demanding that the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, who had the majority support in the Soviet at that time, took the power themselves instead of continuing to prop up the capitalists. At the beginning of June, then that position of the Menshevik Socialist Revolutionaries went over into voting down the 8-hour day, which had been a demand of the socialist movement for a long time. It's what May Day originated from, and they did that at the first Congress of the Soviets that took place. They banned a demonstration that the Bolsheviks had called on the 11th and replaced it with their own demonstration on the 18th in order to try and shore up their own support. But on their demonstration, instead of their slogans coming to the fore, then it was those same Bolshevik slogans I mentioned earlier, down with the 10 capitalist ministers, down with the offensive, all power to the Soviets, which were dominant on that demonstration. The masses were beginning to become impatient. They'd overthrown the old order, yet apart from figures at the top, nothing had changed in their conditions. The Bolsheviks in this time had grown to 200,000 nationally, with around half in Petrograd, but the masses in Petrograd were ahead of the mood of the rest of the country. This is a feature of all revolutionary processes. The capitals play the leading role. Similar things took place with the May Days in Spain in 1937, in Barcelona, the most developed city in Spain, most industrially developed, and the Spartacus Rising in Berlin in Germany 1919. Lenin and the Bolsheviks at that point tried to hold back the movement, but when they saw a further armed demonstration was inevitable, they tried to give leadership to it. But after this demonstration on the 4th of July, the Bolsheviks were vilified for their role, accused of every slander imaginable. They were trying to overthrow the government by conspiracy behind the backs of people. They were accused of having taken German gold and all sorts of slanders. These are slanders we still hear today and are still just as false as they were then. Leading Bolsheviks at that time were arrested, along with Trotsky, who returned to Russia in May after he'd been delayed because he was detained by the British colonial authorities. Trotsky'd been working closely with Lenin and the Bolshevik leadership, although he didn't formally join the Bolsheviks until a month later, in order to win over a group called the Mezriontri, which is the Inter-District Association, is a rough translation, to the Bolsheviks. In order to try and to fuse together all the genuine revolutionary elements. And that group, the Mezriontri, include figures who would play key roles in pending events in the early post-revolution years. Lenin went into hiding at this point, not out of concern for himself, because he was a coward as some of the bourgeois ideologues would have, but in order to try and preserve a leadership for the party that remained free. You only have to look at the fate of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, who didn't do that in the Spartacus events in 1919 and were murdered as a consequence, to realise the importance of that. But despite backing the slander, the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries were beginning to lose support from the masses. Sensing this, General Kornilov, one of the old Tsarist generals, attempted a coup in August, marching on Petrograd under the pretext of putting down a Bolshevik uprising. the same Bolshevik uprising that the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries have been slandering the Bolsheviks about for months by this point. Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, had been in some discussions with Kornilov about crushing the troublesome Soviets and being incorporated into a new national government. However, Kornilov decided he didn't need Kerensky or any sort of democratic overseers. In panic, Kerensky blurted out the plot to the cabinet, where the cadet ministers resigned because they were unwilling to oppose a patriotic revolt. The only forces left to fight the coup now were the Soviets, who Kerensky now helped to arm. The Soviets were revived, coming more and more under the influence of the Bolsheviks. And Lenin sums up the Bolshevik position in relation to this in an article he wrote in August, where he says, even in these circumstances, a Bolshevik would say our soldiers will fight the counter-revolutionary troops. They will do so not to defend the government, that means the government of Kerensky, but to independently defend the revolution as they pursue their own aim. The aim of securing victory for the workers, for the poor, for the cause of peace. Workers organised barricades in Petrograd. Red Guards were armed to defend the city. Railway and telegraph workers were ordered by their union leadership to obstruct Kornilov's forces. But most crucially of all, workers in Petrograd made a political appeal to Kornilov's troops. Under these conditions, the advance collapsed. Troops mutinied in support of the Soviets. The masses demanded and won the release of Trotsky and the other Bolshevik leaders from prison. This whip of counter-revolution pushed events to the left, with similar events which occurred in the Portuguese Revolution after March 1975, where there was an attempted coup, which led to 70% of the economy being nationalised. And we've had a little taste of that in regards to Trump being elected in America and the backlash of protests that have emerged in response to that and some of his initial executive orders. But at this point, the position of the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries was opposed to taking socialist measures. In fact, they didn't even implement the tasks of the bourgeois revolution. They kept postponing elections to a constituent assembly. They instead convened what was called a democratic conference, where seat allocations were decided from above, and that was done in order to prop up the provisional government. Whilst the Bolsheviks grew in strength, winning a majority in the Petrograd Soviet on October the 8th, with Trotsky elected to the president, they continued to do that across the country as well. But it wasn't a straight line from the defeat of Kornilov to the October Revolution. Even within the Bolsheviks, there were hesitations and searching for compromises with the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries. Underlying this, again, was a debate on the nature of the revolution. Was the revolution to carry out the tasks of the bourgeois revolution and limit itself to that? And the argument for that, of course, was the backwardness of Russia, and therefore they needed for time to prepare for building support of the socialist revolution in the future. And therefore, that meant that far from the Soviets taking power, they must lead to the establishment of a bourgeois capitalist parliament, whereas the provisional government, and indeed any of the other structures to replace it, were clearly failing to carry out these tasks. And moreover, the workers demanded that the 8-hour day and other demands were won. But time does not stand still whilst these questions are being debated. Lenin sent letter after letter to the Bolshevik Central Committee to urge them to organise the taking of power. As Trotsky comments in Lessons of October, the strength of the Revolutionary Party increases only up to a certain moment, after which the process can turn into the very opposite. The hopes of the masses change into disillusionment. As a similar point was reached and passed in Germany in 1923, which Trotsky makes a reference towards in that, but also in other events such as China in 1925, with bloody consequences both for the revolutionaries in those countries themselves, but also for what would become of the Soviet Union at that point. Sensing the unrest in Petrograd, then the provisional government made a move in October to transfer some of the unruly troops from Petrograd to the front, partially in preparation for a new offensive, but also in order to rid themselves of opponents. This was met with widespread opposition from workers and soldiers, led by the Soviet, which now formed a revolutionary military committee as a result of this struggle, with government orders to the troops having to receive its blessing before implementation. As Trotsky comments, this actually carried out half the task of taking power. depriving the provisional government of its own forces, splitting the state machine. The second half was the formal side of it, which was completed just before the Second Congress of Soviets was convened, of taking over the key institutions, arresting the provisional government and other high officers of the state, and the Soviet Congress declaring it to be the official power, electing a council of people's commissars with Lenin at its head. And at the beginning of this introduction, I gave a flavour of some of what this new regime was able to achieve. Of course, it can't be ignored that the regime, initiated in October, came to be superseded by the rotten bureaucracy under Stalin and reversing the gains of the revolution. And the ideologues of capitalism argue that the reason for this was that Bolshevism was undemocratic in its very nature. Lenin led to Stalin, so the argument goes. But as we've seen, the Bolsheviks were a very democratic party. They debated stuff out. Lenin, to the point of exasperation at some points, carried on trying to argue and convince people of his position, not just a mechanical imposition as would be the case under Stalin. But the rise of the bureaucracy and Stalin crowning that stems from a number of things of how events developed in the years following October. The first is that despite the best efforts of the Bolsheviks and their co-thinkers internationally, who they gathered into the newly founded Communist International, then revolution wasn't able to expand internationally as Lenin and Trotsky had hoped and based their movement on. And instead, the revolution became isolated. Opportunities were missed. I've mentioned a few already, but Hungary, Germany, Italy, Bulgaria, and other countries had revolutionary movements in that. In the 5 or 6 years after the Russian Revolution. Secondly, even though the Bolsheviks pulled out of the First World War, they had to face 3 years of civil war and armed intervention of all the major imperialist powers into Russia. Many of the most self-sacrificing activists in the Soviets were the first to volunteer fighting. Others died from illnesses that came in the wake of shortages due to the war, and a few were actually executed by those invading armies when they took over cities such as the entire Baku Soviet in modern-day Azerbaijan. Finally, Russia was already a very backwards country and underdeveloped. The vast majority of the population couldn't read and write. Infrastructure was very weak. Revolution spreading could have helped with this. In particular, the exchange of goods with advanced capitalist countries, trading Russia's agricultural surplus with the industrial goods of Germany or Britain or other countries like that. Stalin and the bureaucracy taking power was counter-revolution, but not one that restored capitalism. Trotsky used the analogy of the Thermidorian period in the French Revolution, of a counter-revolution that was on the new basis of society, therefore getting rid of the democratic control of the masses over society, constituting it in one-person rule, but retaining the new economic foundations and basing itself on that. The bureaucracy had to defend the planned economy as it rested upon it. Its privileges rested upon it. Hence, we gave the term, Trotsky did, and we concur with it, of a degenerated worker state, a worker state that had degenerated into a bureaucratic rule. Its existence in the post-war period, because of the weakness of capitalism, led to the creation of states in its image where capitalism collapsed, particularly with the retreat of the Nazis after the Second World War, where the native capitalist classes had collaborated with them and fled with them, leaving a vacuum. What would have been needed in this situation was a political revolution. We had glimpses of this in Hungary in 1956, when workers rose up and attempted to create their own Soviet-like organisations and take power. But unfortunately, those political revolutions that were attempted weren't successful. And instead, the Soviet Union and its satellites collapsed under its own inertia, restoring capitalism in the early 1990s with the collapse of living standards to accompany it as a result of the loss of the planned economy and the gains it brought. Such a monstrous perversion of socialism is unlikely today, for many reasons, including the fact that the world economy is more developed, the working class is more educated, more literate, and the working class in itself is now a majority of the world's population. But these lessons of history are vital for us to study in terms of how they shape the present situation, in terms of the consequences of the existence of the Soviet Union, and even today, with you still have a deformed worker state in Cuba, just off America's coast. But also from what we can learn from these struggles in order to to prepare for our own revolutionary battles, which as capitalism goes into deeper and deeper crisis, as we're seeing, will become on the agenda for us as well.